A former Navy SEAL walked through the frozen paths of Crestfall Park, his past heavy in every step, with Mara, a German shepherd who had lost all her puppies, quietly by his side, the only soul who stayed when everything else felt empty. Then suddenly, Mara froze and pulled hard toward a snow-covered bench, where beneath it a tiny puppy lay shaking, barely breathing, fading into the cold. Before he could react, Mara rushed in and curled her body around the fragile life, refusing to leave, refusing to let it die alone. And the man stood there, realizing his dog had just made a choice he had forgotten long ago, and what happened next would change everything. Because sometimes God sends miracles not with thunder, but through a broken heart that still chooses to love. So tell me where you are watching from, and if you believe in miracles like this, type Amen in the comments below. Crestfall, Colorado, woke beneath a winter hush so complete it seemed the town had been lowered gently under glass during the night. Its narrow streets softened by fresh snow, its storefronts dim behind frosted panes, its church steeple rising above the white roofs like something patient enough to outlast grief. And at the northern edge of town, Crestfall Park lay open and still beneath a pale morning sky, where the wind moved through the pines with a low, cold breath, and every bench path and iron lamppost were a thin burden of ice. Into that silence walked Ethan Walker, a former Navy SEAL of 39, whose body still carried the disciplined shape of long military years, broad through the shoulders, compact through the waist, every movement controlled even now, though time and pain had altered the rhythm of his stride. He leaned on the same black cane he had used since the injury that never fully left him, his damaged leg forcing a slow, deliberate gait that turned every winter walk into a negotiation between endurance and memory. And under the lifted collar of his heavy coat, the hard lines of his face were partly shadowed, though the scar near his temple still caught the light, like something frost had failed to erase. His steel-blue eyes had the faraway alertness of a man who had come home from war without entirely returning, and there was a quiet severity to him that made strangers step aside in grocery aisles and then feel faintly guilty for having done it, because Ethan was not unkind, only distant, shaped by loss into someone who spoke little, observed everything, and gave away nothing he could not afford to lose. Beside him moved Mara, the German shepherd who had become the only steady warmth in his days, a 4-year-old working-line female with a thick sable and black coat, deep chest, strong legs, and the poised, intelligent bearing of a dog bred not merely to obey, but to understand. And if Ethan looked like a man held together by habit, Mara looked like a creature held together by instinct and endurance. Her amber eyes were sharp and watchful, yet there was an old sorrow in them that had never fully faded, a depth that made her seem older than 4 whenever she fell still and listened to something no human could hear. And Ethan knew exactly where that sadness had been born. Nearly a year earlier, he had found her at a rescue outside Colorado Springs after she had lost an entire litter to a fast-moving pneumonia outbreak that swept through overcrowded kennels before anyone could stop it, and the workers there had told him, in the practical, heart-worn voices of people used to explaining pain, that Mara had stopped eating for days afterward, had curled around an empty blanket as if refusing the truth, had become quiet with other dogs, but hyper-aware of any crying puppy in the building. She had not turned aggressive, only changed in that irreversible way living things sometimes do after grief, becoming gentler and more guarded at once, and when Ethan first knelt outside her enclosure, she had not run to him, but simply looked at him with a solemn, searching calm that unsettled him, because it felt too familiar, as though she recognized in him the same surviving after what should have broken you. Since then, Mara had become his shadow, his reason for stepping outdoors on mornings when the cabin felt too silent, and though she was obedient, steady, and deeply responsive to his moods, there remained in her some buried maternal current, some tenderness forced underground by loss, waiting without either of them knowing it for the right wound to call it back. They moved slowly along the park path, boots and paws pressing fresh marks into the powder, while the pond at the center lay frozen beneath a milky sheen, and the snow-muted town seemed too far away to matter. And Ethan let Mara set the pace because on mornings like this he preferred her certainty to his own thoughts. The cold burned clean in his lungs, the kind that made a man feel briefly more awake than alive, and for a while the only sounds were the soft crunch beneath his boots, the faint click of his cane tip against hidden patches of ice, and the occasional jingle from Mara's collar whenever she lifted her head toward the trees. He had come to know these walks as a form of truce, not peace exactly, because peace suggested something settled and finished while his inner life was neither, but a truce between the weight he carried and the hour he had to cross. In Crestfall he was known in the loose, respectful way small towns know damaged veterans, as the tall, quiet man in the cabin near the ridge, the one who fixed his own roof, bought only what he needed, and always walked with the shepherd at dawn. Yet no one in town knew the full architecture of the silence he lived inside. He had survived places where the air smelled of diesel, blood, and sand-heated metal, had returned with a leg that ached before storms, and sleep that broke apart without warning, and now lived as though he were paying out the rest of his life, one measured breath at a time. Mara, with her disciplined stride and occasional backward glance to check on him, understood that rhythm better than anyone. She was not playful this morning, only alert, her breath silver in the air, her ears pricked toward the park's outer edge, where the benches sat beneath bare-limbed maples, half buried in white. Then, all at once, something in her changed, not gradually, but with the total authority of instinct, her head lifting, shoulders tightening, tail going still, as if a live current had passed through her body and fixed every nerve in place. Ethan felt it through the leash before he fully saw it, that sudden pull of attention, and he stopped with a slight drag of his bad leg, eyes narrowing as Mara stood facing a bench near the far edge of the path where the snow lay deeper and fewer people passed. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice low and worn smooth by disuse, but Mara did not look back at him, and that alone was enough to quicken something inside him because she was trained, composed, never the kind of dog to ignore his tone unless something deeper than command had claimed her. The wind shifted across the open stretch of park, carrying with it the faintest sound, so thin Ethan almost mistook it for the scrape of branches. And then Mara moved, not wildly but with fierce purpose, pulling hard enough that the leash tightened against his glove and the cane bit awkwardly into the snow as he tried to follow. She was not chasing, not ranging, not curious. She was going towards something with the absolute moral clarity animals sometimes possess, and by the time Ethan reached the bench, breath fogging in front of him, knee protesting sharply from the sudden pace, Mara had already lowered herself near the drift piled against the wooden slats and was staring into the dim hollow beneath. At first Ethan saw only shadow, a dark shape where snow should have been smooth, but Mara gave a sound he had almost never heard from her before, a low, fractured whine full of urgency and ache, and he crouched with difficulty, using one gloved hand against the bench for balance while the other brushed powder aside. What emerged from under that half-frozen cover was not an object, but a life barely holding its place in the world. A tiny puppy no more than 8 weeks old, its body curled into itself so tightly it looked less like a sleeping animal than a piece of discarded sorrow. Its fur was wet and clumped, darkened by melted frost and filth, its sides hollow with hunger, its paws red and raw from the cold, and when Ethan cleared the last veil of snow from its face, he saw eyes that were open but dim, the eyes of something too exhausted even for fear, though fear still lived there. The pup's breathing came in shallow, fragile pulls that scarcely seemed enough to keep it anchored, and one ear twitched weakly, as if in answer to a world already receding beyond it. Ethan did not yet know whether it was male or female, where it had come from, or how long it had been left there beneath the bench at the mercy of the night. But he knew neglect when he saw it, knew the look of a body that had been forced to spend too long without warmth, food, or protection. Behind the practiced stillness of his face, something tightened hard in his chest, because winter in a town like Crestfall could kill quickly, and this small creature had already crossed too close to that line. Before he could reach farther, Mara stepped in with a certainty that made his hand stop in midair, lowering herself onto the snow and inching toward the puppy with slow, trembling care, her whole posture transformed from alertness into something deeper and older, something almost sacred in its intensity. She bent her head, touched her nose once to the pup's neck, and then, with a softness that seemed to come from a place grief had preserved rather than destroyed, she lay down fully and curved her body around it, drawing the shivering little thing against the dense warmth of her chest and belly, as though her muscles remembered before her mind did what to do with the young and the vulnerable. The puppy flinched at first, a tiny convulsion of fear, but Mara did not retreat, did not force, did not crowd beyond what was needed. She simply held herself there, making of her own body a shelter against the ice, and when the pup gave a faint, ragged breath and pressed almost imperceptibly into her fur, Ethan felt the air leave him in a slow, stunned exhale. He had seen Mara disciplined, intelligent, obedient, protective, and once or twice quietly affectionate, but he had never seen this, never seen the locked chamber of her old motherhood thrown open all at once by the sight of a freezing stray beneath a public bench. She trembled, whether from cold or emotion he could not tell, yet she would not move an inch away, and in the line of her spine, the tuck of her foreleg, the guarded arch of her neck around that tiny body, there was the unmistakable shape of loss turning itself, without permission, into love. Ethan stayed crouched there longer than the cold should have allowed, his knee throbbing, his cane fallen sideways in the snow beside him, because the sight in front of him had reached into a place he had spent years teaching himself not to feel from. On the surface this was simple enough, a shepherd dog protecting a stray puppy, but beneath that plain fact ran something larger, harder to name, a recognition of the way living beings sometimes go on choosing tenderness after tenderness has cost them too much. Mara had lost her own litter, and somehow, impossibly, the emptiness in her had not calcified into indifference. It had remained tender under the scar tissue, and now, here in the freezing quiet of Crestfall Park, it was rising back to the surface in full view of a man who had long ago decided that surviving and opening your heart again were two entirely different wars. He looked at the small puppy whose weak breaths were beginning, perhaps only slightly, perhaps only because hope needed a place to land, to fall into a steadier rhythm against Mara's fur, and then at Mara herself, whose amber eyes flicked up to meet his for one brief second. Not pleading, not asking, but telling him with a force beyond language that she had chosen and would not abandon what she had found. In that moment the winter park, the frozen pond, the silent town, even the years Ethan had spent reducing his life to manageable distances, all seemed to narrow into this single scene beneath a bench where one grieving dog refused to let another creature die alone. Snow moved lightly across the path behind them, skimming the ground in silver threads, and Ethan slowly reached down to retrieve his cane without breaking the fragile stillness Mara had created, his gloved fingers clumsy now, not from cold, but from the pressure gathering in his throat. He was not yet thinking beyond the moment, not yet forming plans or naming consequences, because the chapter of this morning had not gone that far, and neither had his heart. All he knew was that the walk had ended under this bench at the edge of Crestfall Park, with one half-frozen puppy gathered into the warmth of a dog who had once lost everything a mother could lose, and with himself standing witness to the first true fracture in the numb routine that had governed his days. The wind pressed softly at the back of his coat. The town remained pale and distant through the trees, and Mara kept her body curved around the trembling little life beneath her, as if the whole white world could wait until warmth returned to it. Ethan stared at them, silent and motionless, except for the slow rise of his breath, and understood with the deep, unsettling clarity that sometimes comes only once a life has already hardened around grief, that whatever came after this morning, something had already shifted, because Mara had followed a cry into the snow and found not only a dying puppy, but the first living thing in a long while, capable of reaching them both where they still hurt. The moment Ethan finally moved, the spell beneath the snow-covered bench broke not with urgency, but with a careful, deliberate shift, as though even his decision to act needed to respect the fragile life Mara had already chosen to protect. And when he reached down, sliding one arm beneath the tiny, trembling body while keeping his other hand steady against Mara's shoulder, the puppy felt impossibly light, more like a bundle of cold breath than flesh, its ribs sharp beneath his glove, its head lolling weakly against his wrist as if it had already begun drifting somewhere beyond reach. Mara did not resist when he lifted the pup, but she rose instantly, pressing close, her body angled protectively against Ethan's leg, her nose brushing repeatedly against the small creature now cradled in his arms, checking, confirming, refusing to lose contact for even a second. And as Ethan straightened, ignoring the flare of pain in his injured leg, he knew without needing to say it aloud that wherever he went next, Mara would not leave this animal behind. Not now, not after what she had already decided beneath that bench in the snow. The walk out of Crestfall Park felt longer than the one that had led them there, not because of distance, but because of the weight Ethan carried in his arms and the quiet tension coiled through Mara's body at his side, the town no longer distant but slowly emerging from the veil of white as he moved toward Main Street, where a handful of early risers cleared snow from storefronts, and the faint hum of life returned in cautious, winter-muted motion. He did not hesitate in choosing where to go, because in a place like Crestfall, there was only one destination for something caught this close to death. And that was the small veterinary clinic at the edge of town, a single-story brick building with a green sign that read, Bennett Animal Care, its windows glowing faintly gold against the cold morning. Ethan adjusted his grip on the puppy as he walked, instinct guiding the steadiness of his hold, even after years away from active service, and beneath the numb chill seeping through his coat, he could feel the faintest movement, a fragile pulse of life still holding on, and that alone was enough to keep him moving through the pain, through the cold, through the long habit of staying uninvolved in things that might matter too much. Inside the clinic, warmth met him in a quiet rush that carried the sterile scent of antiseptic layered over something softer, the familiar presence of animals who had passed through suffering and come out the other side, and behind the front desk stood Claire Bennett, the only veterinarian in Crestfall, a woman in her mid-40s with auburn hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame a face marked not by age alone but by long years of responsibility carried without complaint. She was of average height, slender but not fragile, her posture straight in the way of someone accustomed to long hours on her feet, and her green eyes held a steady, practiced kindness that did not waver even when faced with the worst cases. A composure shaped in part by the loss of her husband years earlier, a firefighter who had died in a highway accident during a winter response, leaving her to raise their son and run the clinic alone. And perhaps it was that history that had given her the quiet resilience that defined her presence now. When she looked up and saw Ethan standing in the doorway with snow clinging to his coat and a half-frozen puppy in his arms, her expression changed not into alarm, but into focus, the kind that cut through emotion to reach action immediately. "Bring him here," she said, already moving, her voice calm and grounded, and Ethan crossed the room without question, setting the puppy gently on the examination table, while Mara followed so closely that her shoulder brushed his leg with every step, her eyes fixed on the small body as if distance itself were a threat. Claire worked quickly, her hands steady as she assessed the puppy's condition, fingers tracing along its ribs, checking its temperature, lifting one paw at a time to examine the damage from the cold. And as she did, she spoke in a low, reassuring tone not only to the animal, but to the room itself, as though calm could be extended outward like a blanket. "Severe hypothermia, dehydration, underweight," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan, though her words carried clearly enough. But still responsive, still fighting. And she glanced up briefly, meeting Ethan's eyes with a quiet acknowledgement that this one might yet be saved. What caught her attention next, however, was not the puppy, but Mara, who had positioned herself so close to the table that her chest pressed lightly against its edge, her head lowered near the pup, her breathing slow but deliberate, as if she were trying to regulate the smaller body through her own rhythm. Claire paused for a fraction of a second, studying the shepherd with professional curiosity and something softer beneath it, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "She's helping," she said, not as a question but as a statement, recognizing instinct when she saw it, and Ethan exhaled quietly, though he hadn't realized he had been holding his breath until that moment. From the hallway behind the clinic came the sound of a door opening, followed by the soft scuff of sneakers on tile, and a boy appeared at the threshold, pausing when he saw the scene unfolding inside the exam room. Noah Bennett, 13 years old, stood slightly taller than most boys his age, but carried himself with a reserved caution that made him seem smaller at first glance, his dark brown hair falling unevenly across his forehead, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn hoodie that suggested comfort mattered more than appearance. He had grown up around injured animals, around the quiet urgency of his mother's work, and that upbringing had given him a sensitivity that often bordered on over-awareness, as though he could feel the emotional weight in a room before anyone spoke it aloud. Since his father's death, Noah had become both quieter and more observant, spending long hours after school helping at the clinic, learning not only how to assist, but how to notice, and it was that habit that now drew his gaze not just to the puppy, but to the worn collar still loosely fastened around its neck. He stepped closer, careful not to startle Mara, who flicked her eyes toward him once before returning her attention to the puppy, and Noah crouched lightly, tilting his head as he examined the collar from a distance. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but carrying a note of something sharper beneath it. "That collar? I think I've seen one like it before." And Claire glanced at him briefly, trusting his instincts, even if she did not yet understand what he meant. "Where?" she asked, continuing her work, and Noah hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether what he remembered mattered enough to say out loud, then continued, "Near the old gas depot outside town, the one that's been closed for years. There's a truck that shows up there sometimes, late at night, and I've heard dogs, more than one, like they're being kept somewhere they shouldn't be." Ethan's attention shifted subtly at that, not outwardly dramatic, but inwardly precise, the way a trained mind registers a detail and stores it without immediate reaction. And he glanced at the collar now as well, noting its worn leather, the faint imprint where a tag might once have been, the absence of any clear identification, all small things on their own, but not insignificant when placed against what Noah had just said. Claire frowned slightly, concern crossing her features, though she did not stop working, because for now the puppy on the table mattered more than unanswered questions. "We'll talk about that later," she said gently, though the tone suggested she would not forget it, and Noah nodded, stepping back just enough to give her space, though his eyes lingered on the collar as if it held a piece of something larger. Minutes passed in careful, quiet motion as Claire administered fluids, wrapped the puppy in warm towels, and monitored its breathing, and through it all, Mara remained anchored beside the table, shifting only when necessary, her body language unwavering in its intent, while Ethan stood a few steps back, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, watching with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that some battles were fought best by not interfering. When the puppy finally gave a slightly stronger breath, its chest rising more fully than before, Claire allowed herself the smallest release of tension, her shoulders easing as she adjusted the blanket around it. "He's stabilizing," she said quietly, then glanced at Ethan. You got him here in time." Ethan nodded once, the motion minimal, his gaze moving from the puppy to Mara, who now lowered her head closer, touching her nose gently to the small bundle as if confirming what Claire had said. And in that moment, something in Ethan shifted again, not as sharply as before, but just enough to register. He had intended, when he first lifted the puppy beneath the bench, to bring it here and leave it in the care of professionals, to return to his cabin with Mara and resume the narrow, controlled routine he had built for himself. But as he watched the way the small body instinctively leaned toward Mara's warmth, even in its weakened state, and the way Mara held herself there as if any separation would undo what had begun, that intention felt less certain, less solid than it had only minutes earlier. "What's his name?" Noah asked suddenly, looking between Ethan and his mother, and the question hung in the air for a moment, simple but carrying a quiet weight, because naming something meant claiming it, even if only temporarily. Ethan looked at the puppy again, at the fragile life that had refused to disappear beneath a park bench. Then at Mara, whose eyes lifted to meet his with that same unyielding certainty she had shown in the snow. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "Benny." The name coming without explanation, without deliberation, as though it had already been decided somewhere deeper than thought. Claire gave a faint smile, writing it down on the chart, while Noah nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath as if fixing it in place. And Mara's tail gave the smallest movement, not a wag, but something close, a subtle acknowledgement that the unnamed had been given a place in the world again. Ethan exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, and as he stood there in the warm light of the clinic, with Mara pressed close to the table, and Benny wrapped in blankets fighting his way back from the edge, he understood with growing clarity that this was no longer just a matter of rescue and release, no longer something that could be handed off and forgotten, because whatever had begun beneath that snow-covered bench had followed them here, had taken shape, and was not yet finished. By the time Ethan Walker carried Benny out of Claire Bennett's clinic and back into the pale brightness of Crest Falls winter morning, the sky had shifted from the flat gray of early cold into a brittle blue that made the snowfields shimmer like glass. And the town, though still quiet, had begun to breathe again in small, cautious motions. The slow opening of doors, the scrape of shovels, the distant hum of engines warming against the cold. He held the small bundle close against his chest, wrapped in the clinic's spare wool blanket, feeling the faint, uneven rise and fall of breath through the fabric. And Mara walked pressed against his side with a focus that bordered on vigilance, her body angled protectively toward Benny, as though even the open air itself posed a threat. Ethan did not speak as he made his way back toward the truck, because there was nothing to say yet that would not make the situation more real than he was ready to admit. And when he finally settled Benny carefully onto the passenger seat, securing the blanket so the small body would not shift, Mara climbed in beside him without needing a command, positioning herself with deliberate precision so that her flank rested against the puppy, her warmth transferring through the layers in a quiet, continuous exchange that seemed to matter more than anything Ethan could provide. The drive to the cabin took them out of Crest Falls' narrow streets and into the winding road that climbed along the edge of the forest, where tall pines leaned under the weight of snow, and the silence deepened into something older, more complete, broken only by the crunch of tires over ice and the low, steady hum of the engine. Ethan drove with one hand firm on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the blanket around Benny without fully looking away from the road, his movements instinctive, controlled, the kind learned long before in environments where distraction could cost more than comfort. His cabin sat alone at the edge of a small clearing where the trees thinned just enough to let light through in the mornings. A simple wooden structure built decades earlier and maintained by necessity rather than pride, its porch worn but solid, its chimney already trailing a faint thread of smoke against the sky. It was not a place designed for more than one man and a dog, not a place meant for life to grow in any meaningful way. But as Ethan stepped out of the truck and carried Benny inside, followed closely by Mara, something about the space shifted, not in its structure, but in its purpose, as though the quiet had been waiting for a reason to break. Inside, the cabin held the familiar scent of wood smoke, leather, and the faint trace of cold that never quite left in winter. And Ethan moved with efficient certainty, laying Benny down on a folded blanket near the fireplace where the heat would reach him steadily without overwhelming his fragile condition. The fire crackled softly, its orange glow casting long, shifting shadows along the walls where a few photographs hung in simple frames, remnants of a life before Crestfall, before silence became routine. Mara wasted no time in settling beside the puppy, lowering herself carefully so that her body curved around him in the same protective shape she had taken beneath the bench, her head resting just above his neck, her breathing slow and measured, as though she were setting the rhythm Benny needed to follow. Ethan stood for a moment watching them, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, his posture still but not relaxed, because what he was witnessing was not just care, not just instinct, but something deeper, something that unsettled him precisely because it felt so deliberate. He moved to the small kitchen area, preparing a shallow bowl of softened food Claire had sent with him, along with instructions delivered in her calm, steady voice that still echoed faintly in his mind. And when he returned, he placed the bowl within reach, but did not force it, because he understood enough about fragile things to know that survival could not be rushed. Mara lifted her head slightly, watching him, then nudged the edge of the bowl closer to Benny with a gentle push of her nose, a small, deliberate action that carried more intention than any command Ethan could have given. And after a long moment, the puppy stirred, his nose twitching weakly before inching toward the scent, his movements hesitant, uncertain, but driven by something stronger than fear. Ethan crouched nearby, his injured leg protesting quietly, but he ignored it, his attention fixed on the fragile exchange unfolding in front of him. And when Benny finally took the smallest bite, barely more than a taste, something in the room shifted again, a subtle release of tension that neither man nor dog acknowledged aloud, but both felt. That night the cabin did not settle into its usual silence, because silence had been replaced by sound, small but persistent, the soft whimper of a puppy caught in dreams he could not escape, the low, steady rumble of Mara's reassurance as she adjusted her body closer each time Benny flinched awake, and the occasional movement of Ethan himself, rising from his chair or from the narrow bed in the corner to check, to adjust, to stand quietly in the dim firelight as if guarding something he had not yet decided to claim. Benny's fear did not fade easily, because fear learned in cold and abandonment does not dissolve in warmth alone, and more than once he scrambled awkwardly beneath the small wooden table, pressing himself into the darkest corner he could find whenever the wind struck the cabin too sharply, or a log shifted in the fire with a sudden crack. Each time Mara followed, not forcing him out, not crowding him, but lying just close enough that her presence could be felt without becoming a threat, her patience infinite in the way only animals untouched by pride can manage. And Ethan, watching from across the room, saw something in those moments that he recognized with uncomfortable clarity, because he had done the same once, though his hiding places had been inside his own mind. Across town, under the fluorescent lights of the Crestfall Sheriff's Office, a different kind of tension was beginning to take shape, quiet but deliberate, as Noah Bennett stood just inside the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, while he waited for Deputy Ryan Brooks to finish his conversation with another officer. Ryan Brooks was a man in his late 30s, tall and broad in the way of someone who had grown up working outdoors, his dark hair kept short beneath a worn sheriff's cap, his face marked by a permanent half-shadow of stubble that gave him a perpetually tired look even when he was fully alert. He had been with the department for over a decade, long enough to know every road in and out of Crestfall, long enough to understand that most problems in a town like this did not announce themselves loudly, but crept in quietly, disguised as something ordinary, until they became too large to ignore. He was not a man given to unnecessary suspicion, but he was observant, patient, and shaped by years of small investigations that had taught him that patterns mattered more than single events. When Noah finally approached, Ryan turned his attention fully to him, recognizing the boy immediately as Claire Bennett's son, and understanding without needing explanation that if Noah had come here on his own, it was not for something trivial. Noah spoke carefully, choosing his words with the same caution he had learned from years of watching his mother handle fragile situations. And as he described the old gas depot, the truck he had seen more than once, the faint but unmistakable sound of dogs coming from a place where no animals should have been. Ryan listened without interruption, his expression steady, but sharpening slightly with each detail. He did not dismiss the story, not because he believed it entirely yet, but because he had already been tracking a quiet series of reports over the past few months, missing puppies, stray sightings that did not align, small inconsistencies that had not yet formed a clear picture but refused to disappear entirely. "All right," Ryan said finally, his voice low and measured. "You did the right thing coming here." And he reached for a notepad, jotting down the details Noah provided, though his mind was already moving ahead, connecting what he had just heard with the fragments he had been holding on to for weeks. He did not promise anything more than that, because experience had taught him not to speak conclusions before they were earned. But as Noah left the station, Ryan leaned back slightly in his chair, staring at the notes in front of him with a focus that suggested something had just shifted, something small but significant, the kind of detail that turns a suspicion into the beginning of a case. Back at the cabin, Ethan sat in the low chair near the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped as he watched Mara and Benny in the quiet flicker of light. The scene in front of him both simple and impossibly complex at the same time. Benny had moved closer now, no longer hiding entirely beneath the table, though he still flinched at sudden sounds, his body tensing in ways that spoke of a past Ethan could only guess at, and each time it happened, Mara adjusted, leaned, pressed closer until the tension eased, until the small body relaxed again against hers. Ethan saw himself in that fear more clearly than he wanted to admit, saw the reflexive withdrawal, the instinct to disappear when the world grew too loud or too unpredictable. And for the first time in a long while, he did not look away from it. He studied it, not as a problem to fix, but as something to understand, because Mara was not forcing Benny to change. She was simply giving him a reason to. The cabin, which had once felt like a place designed only to hold absence, now carried a different weight, a quiet presence that filled the space between objects, between breaths, between the long hours Ethan used to spend alone with nothing but memory and routine. He shifted slightly in his chair, the movement slow, controlled, his legs stiff from the day's strain, and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry more than just fatigue with it. He had intended this to be temporary, a matter of doing what was necessary and nothing more, but as he watched Mara lower her head gently over Benny's small body, her eyes half closed in a calm that had not existed before, he understood that something had already changed beyond his control. This was no longer just about saving a life, it was about what that life, fragile and uncertain as it was, had already begun to do to the space around it, to Mara, and perhaps, though he did not say it aloud, to him as well. The fire burned low as the night deepened, the wind moving steadily through the trees outside, and inside the cabin, two wounded lives lay pressed together, one learning to trust again, the other remembering how to give that trust shape, while Ethan Walker sat in the quiet between them, no longer entirely separate from what was unfolding. And though he had not yet made any decision about what would come next, he understood with a clarity that settled slowly but firmly into place that whatever this was, whatever had begun beneath that snow-covered bench and followed them home, it was no longer something he could step away from without leaving part of himself behind. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm across Crestfall, where the snow no longer fell in heavy sheets but drifted in thin, restless patterns across the frozen ground. And though the town seemed unchanged to anyone passing through, something quieter had begun to shift beneath its surface, carried not by noise, but by the accumulation of small, unnoticed details. Inside the Bennett home, which sat just behind the veterinary clinic and bore the same understated signs of endurance as its owner, Noah Bennett stood at the edge of the kitchen, his fingers wrapped around the rim of a chipped ceramic mug he had not yet touched, his posture tense in a way that betrayed the weight he had been carrying for days. Claire Bennett, moving between the counter and the stove with the steady efficiency that defined her, paused when she saw the look on her son's face, because she had learned long ago that Noah did not speak unless something mattered deeply enough to overcome his instinct to stay silent. She set the spoon down, turned fully toward him, and waited, not pressing, not rushing, allowing him the space he needed to find his words. When Noah finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, as though each sentence needed to be placed correctly before it could be trusted to exist, and he told her everything he had held back, the nights he had ridden his bike farther than she had allowed, the abandoned warehouse near the old highway depot where the rusted gas pumps still stood like broken markers of a forgotten time, the faint but unmistakable sounds of multiple dogs echoing through metal walls that should have held nothing but emptiness. He admitted that he had been afraid, not only of what might be inside, but of being wrong, of causing trouble where none existed. And Claire listened without interruption, her expression tightening, not with anger, but with a growing, focused concern that sharpened her features. She did not scold him for waiting, because she understood fear well enough to know it did not respond to reprimand, and instead she placed one hand gently over his, grounding him in the present, before speaking with a quiet certainty that carried both authority and care. "You did the right thing telling me now," she said, and though her voice remained calm, there was a firmness beneath it that made clear this was no longer something to be set aside. Within the hour, Claire had contacted Deputy Ryan Brooks, and when he arrived at the clinic, his presence carried with it the subtle shift of a man who had moved from suspicion into intention. He listened again to Noah's account, this time in person, asking precise, measured questions that revealed more about his method than his tone ever would, noting distances, times, directions, the kind of details that built structure around instinct. As Noah spoke, Ryan's gaze flicked occasionally toward Claire, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging the trust placed in him. And when the boy finished, Ryan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening in thought. "This lines up," he said quietly, not elaborating yet, but the weight of those words settled into the room with quiet gravity. He had already been tracking irregularities, small things that had not made sense on their own, reports of missing puppies that did not match typical stray patterns, inconsistent paperwork from a temporary animal holding facility registered just outside town limits, transactions that moved through cash rather than traceable channels. And now, with Noah's account, the shape of something larger began to emerge. It was later that afternoon when Ryan made his way to Ethan Walker's cabin, his truck cutting a deliberate path through the snow-covered road that wound along the ridge. And as he stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the cold, he paused for a moment to take in the scene before him, the quiet isolation of the place, the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, the sense that this was a man who had chosen distance not out of preference, but necessity. When Ethan opened the door, the contrast between them was immediate. Two men shaped by different paths, but familiar enough with hardship to recognize it in each other without explanation. Ryan introduced himself without formality, his tone direct but respectful, and Ethan listened, his expression unreadable, as the deputy outlined what he knew, what he suspected, and what he might need. "You understand tracking, observation, reading patterns," Ryan said, not as flattery but as fact, and Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not away but inward, as though weighing the words against something he had long ago decided to leave behind. He did not respond immediately, because the request carried more than its surface suggested, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying no anger but a clear boundary. "I'm not that man anymore," he said, and though the sentence was simple, the finality within it left no room for misunderstanding. Ryan did not push because he had expected resistance, and instead he nodded once, accepting the answer without argument, though the quiet in his posture suggested he would not abandon the path entirely. Inside the cabin, the air held the steady warmth of the fire, and Mara lay beside Benny near the hearth, her body curved protectively around him in a posture that had become second nature, while Benny, though stronger than before, still carried the fragile tension of something not yet convinced it was safe. When Noah arrived shortly after, having ridden with Ryan from town, he carried with him a folded piece of fabric, old and worn, something he had found near the depot days earlier but had not understood until now. He hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether he should have brought it, but Claire's earlier reassurance echoed in his mind, and he stepped forward, holding it out carefully. "I found this near the warehouse," he said, his voice quieter now in the presence of Ethan, whose stillness seemed to command attention without effort. Ethan took the fabric without speaking, unfolding it slowly, and as he did, the faint scent that clung to it rose into the room, subtle but distinct, a mixture of damp straw, metal, and something else harder to define, something that carried the weight of confinement. The reaction came not from Ethan, but from Benny, who had been resting with his head against Mara's side until that moment when his body stiffened abruptly, his breath catching in a sharp involuntary pull, before he scrambled backward, claws scraping against the wooden floor as he retreated beneath the table, his small frame trembling violently in a way that erased all the fragile progress of the past days. Mara reacted instantly, rising and moving to him without hesitation, her body lowering as she pressed herself close, her head dipping beneath the edge of the table to reach him, her presence steady and unyielding as she tried to anchor him against the surge of panic. Ethan watched the scene unfold with a focus that sharpened into something colder, more precise, because this was no longer abstract, no longer a possibility suggested by second-hand accounts, but a direct, undeniable response, the kind that came from memory etched deeper than thought. He crouched slowly, setting the fabric aside, his gaze fixed on Benny as the puppy continued to tremble, his eyes wide and unfocused, caught somewhere between past and present, and for a moment Ethan saw it again. Not the dog, but the pattern, the imprint of experience that did not fade, simply because circumstances had changed. Ryan, standing near the door, exhaled slowly, the last of his uncertainty dissolving into something firmer. "That's enough for me," he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, but the statement carried weight, a line crossed from suspicion into certainty. And Claire, who had arrived just moments earlier, took in the scene with a controlled stillness, her expression tightening, not in surprise, but in confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. Together, in the quiet aftermath of Benny's reaction, the pieces aligned, not perfectly but clearly enough to form a direction. The warehouse, the missing dogs, the inconsistent records, the behavior of a puppy who had known confinement and fear long before being found beneath a bench. That evening, as the light faded and the cold deepened once more around the cabin, the conversation continued in quieter tones, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, each detail placed carefully into the growing structure of what they were beginning to understand. They spoke of the facility registered as a temporary holding center, of the lack of proper documentation, of animals that seemed to disappear between intake and relocation, of money exchanged without trace. And through it all, Ethan remained mostly silent, listening, observing, his mind moving through the information with a familiarity he could not fully deny. He had not wanted to return to this kind of thinking, to the pattern recognition, the strategic mapping of unseen threats. But as he sat there, the reality of what was being described settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore. Later, after Ryan and Noah had left, and the cabin had returned to its quieter state, Ethan stood near the window, looking out at the darkened tree line where the snow reflected what little light remained, his reflection faint in the glass, his expression unreadable, even to himself. Behind him, Mara lay once more with Benny, her body curved around him in that same protective arc, her breathing steady, her presence unwavering, and Benny, exhausted from the earlier panic, had finally settled again, his small body pressed close, seeking the warmth he had learned to trust. Ethan watched them for a long moment, the stillness stretching, and in that silence, the choice he had tried to avoid began to take shape, not as a sudden decision, but as a slow, unavoidable understanding. If he turned away now, if he left this to others, to systems that had already failed once, there would be more like Benny, more small lives left in the cold, more suffering hidden behind walls that no one had yet forced open. He did not speak the thought aloud, because it did not need words, and as he finally stepped back from the window, his gaze shifting once more to Mara and the puppy she refused to abandon, he understood that the line he had drawn for himself years ago was no longer where he had left it. What had begun as a single rescue beneath a snow-covered bench had become something larger, something that reached beyond one life. And though he had not yet said yes, the silence of the cabin held the quiet certainty that he would not remain on the outside much longer. The storm arrived without ceremony, but with absolute authority, rolling down from the high ridges beyond Crestfall as a wall of wind and white that swallowed distance and sound alike, until the town disappeared behind a shifting veil of snow that erased edges, swallowed roads, and turned every familiar landmark into something uncertain and cold. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened into a heavy, bruised gray, and the pines along the outer roads bent under the pressure of the gale, their branches thrashing like restless limbs against the force that drove through them. Inside the sheriff's office, the air held a different kind of tension, not from the storm itself, but from the decision that had finally been made as Deputy Ryan Brooks stood near the central desk with a warrant in hand, the paper already marked with signatures that carried legal weight but did nothing to ease the urgency pressing behind his ribs. The evidence had aligned just enough, the reports, the inconsistencies, the testimony Noah had provided, and now there was no more room for waiting. He had called for a limited team, knowing the storm would cut visibility and movement, knowing it would reduce backup if things went wrong, and yet also knowing it might be the only chance to catch whatever was hidden behind that warehouse before it vanished again. Ethan Walker did not arrive with fanfare, nor did he speak immediately when he stepped into the station, snow already clinging to his coat from the walk across the lot, his presence quiet but grounded, the kind that shifted the room, not through authority, but through experience. He had not intended to come, had spent hours at the cabin turning the decision over, in silence while the wind began to rise outside, but in the end, the image of Mara curled around Benny beneath the firelight, and the memory of the puppy's violent panic at the scent from the warehouse had settled the matter in a way logic alone could not. When Ryan met his gaze, there was no need for explanation, only a brief nod that acknowledged what had changed, and as Ethan stepped closer, his movements carried a precision that had not been visible before, not because it had been gone, but because it had been held back until now. He did not reclaim the man he used to be, but he allowed enough of him to surface to do what needed to be done. They moved out just before dusk, the convoy smaller than Ryan would have preferred, but as large as the conditions allowed, 2 patrol vehicles and a rescue van prepared for transport if the worst proved true, their headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the thickening snowfall as they left the town limits behind and followed the road toward the old depot. The storm pressed in from all sides, reducing visibility to a few yards at best, and the wind drove snow across the road in sharp, blinding sheets that forced the drivers to slow, to rely on instinct and memory more than sight. Ethan rode in the passenger seat of Ryan's truck, his posture steady despite the uneven motion, his eyes scanning the terrain, not for what was visible, but for what might be hidden within it, reading the movement of trees, the shifts in wind, the faint outlines of structures buried beneath the storm's cover. He spoke little, offering only the occasional adjustment to their approach, guiding Ryan not with commands, but with quiet observations that revealed how much of that training still lived beneath the surface. Back at the cabin, the storm's presence felt different, not distant, but immediate, pressing against the windows with a force that made the glass tremble slightly within its frame. And inside, Mara paced the length of the room with a restless intensity that had not been seen since the day she found Benny beneath the bench. Her movements were not random, but driven, her head lifting sharply at each change in the wind, her ears angling toward sounds that did not reach human hearing, and though the fire burned steady in the hearth, the warmth it provided did little to settle her. Benny, stronger now but still fragile in ways that had not yet healed, watched her from near the door, his small body tense, his instincts pulling him toward the same unease without fully understanding its source. When a particularly strong gust struck the cabin, rattling the door against its frame, Benny flinched, but instead of retreating beneath the table, as he once would have, he moved forward, drawn by something deeper than fear, until he stood beside Mara, his gaze fixed on the door, as if the world beyond it called to him in a language he could not ignore. At the warehouse, the structure loomed through the storm like a shadow given form, its corrugated metal sides coated in ice, its windows dark, its isolation complete in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Ryan signaled for the vehicles to cut their lights as they approached, and the sudden darkness closed in around them, broken only by the sweep of wind-driven snow and the faint outline of the building ahead. Ethan stepped out first, his boots sinking slightly into the drift as he moved, his body adjusting instantly to the conditions, his awareness expanding outward, mapping the space in front of him, not just through sight, but through sound, movement, and the subtle absence of both. The rest of the team followed, their movements more cautious, less fluid, and Ryan gave a brief, low set of instructions before they advanced, each step measured, each position deliberate. The breach was not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, the door forced open with a calculated application of pressure that avoided unnecessary noise, and as they entered, the air inside struck them with a wave of stale warmth and something else beneath it, a smell that carried confinement, neglect, and the unmistakable presence of too many animals in too little space. The sound came next, faint at first, but unmistakable, the overlapping whimpers and barks of multiple dogs echoing through the interior, some weak, some frantic, all contained. Ryan moved ahead, his weapon drawn but held steady, while Ethan shifted slightly to the side, his role unspoken but clear, covering angles, reading movement, anticipating response. The lights flickered on as they advanced deeper into the structure, revealing rows of makeshift enclosures, metal cages stacked and arranged without care for comfort or safety, each one holding a small life reduced to survival. Among them, one figure stood out, a female dog lying on her side within a cage barely large enough to contain her, her coat dull and matted, her ribs visible beneath stretched skin, her eyes open but heavy with exhaustion, and around her several puppies huddled close, their bodies thin, their movements weak. The sight struck with a force that needed no explanation, because even without words, the connection to what Mara had lost was immediate and undeniable, the echo of that grief now given form in another place, another life. Ryan's jaw tightened as he took it in, and he moved quickly, calling out for the rescue team to begin extraction, his voice controlled but carrying urgency. The confrontation came fast, not because it had been planned, but because desperation rarely waits. As two men emerged from a back corridor, their movements erratic, their expressions caught between shock and calculation. One of them, tall and thin, with a gaunt face and eyes that darted constantly, reached for something at his side, while the other, heavier, slower, hesitated just long enough for Ethan to close the distance. What followed was not prolonged, not dramatic, but efficient, the kind of controlled force that ended resistance before it could escalate. Ethan's movements precise, grounded in muscle memory that had not faded despite years of disuse. Ryan moved in tandem, securing the second man with practiced speed, and within moments the threat was contained, the focus returning immediately to the lives that mattered more. Back at the cabin, the storm reached its peak, the wind howling with a force that seemed almost alive. And Benny, standing now at the door with Mara beside him, lifted his head and let out a sound that had not been heard from him before. A long, raw howl that cut through the noise of the storm and echoed into the night. It was not fear, not entirely, but something deeper, something instinctive, as though the connection between him and the man who had carried him out of the snow stretched across distance and danger alike. Mara stilled beside him, her posture shifting from restlessness into something more focused, her eyes fixed on the door as if she could see beyond it, as if she understood that whatever had drawn Ethan away now held him in its grip. By the time the convoy began its return, the storm had not lessened, but its intensity had shifted, the wind still strong but the snowfall thinning just enough to allow movement, and as the vehicles cut their way back toward Crestfall, their cargo was no longer empty. Inside the rescue van, cages held the survivors, small bodies pressed together for warmth, their eyes wide but alive, the exhausted mother dog among them, her head lifting weakly as if in acknowledgment of a world she had not expected to see again. Ethan sat in silence, his shoulder dusted with ice, his breath slow and controlled, the tension of the operation settling into something quieter, heavier, as the adrenaline faded and reality took its place. When they finally reached the cabin, the headlights swept across the clearing, illuminating the porch, the trees, the door that opened before the engine had fully stopped, and Mara was there, already moving, her body cutting through the cold as she rushed toward the vehicles, her nose working rapidly, her focus absolute. She moved from cage to cage, not frantic, but searching, as if counting, as if confirming, her instincts guiding her through the line of rescued lives with a purpose that needed no direction. Benny followed more slowly, his steps uncertain, but determined, his eyes fixed on the movement, on the sound, on the presence of something larger than himself. Ethan stepped down from the truck, his boots hitting the snow with a dull thud. And for a moment he stood still, watching Mara as she moved among the cages like a mother searching for what had once been taken from her. Behind him, the rescue van doors opened fully, revealing the full extent of what had been saved, and the storm, though still present, no longer felt as overwhelming as it had hours before, because the weight it carried had shifted, no longer pressing down but lifting, just enough to allow breath. Mara paused finally, her head lifting as she turned back toward Ethan, her eyes meeting his across the distance. And in that silent exchange, the purpose of what had been done settled into place. Not as victory, not as closure, but as something quieter and more enduring. The storm still moved through Crestfall, but inside that clearing, among the rescued and the living, something else had begun to take hold. In the weeks that followed the storm, Crestfall did not erupt into chaos as larger cities might have, but instead shifted in the quiet, deliberate way of small towns that absorb shock slowly and then carry it together. the story of what had been uncovered, spreading from porch to storefront, from the diner on Main Street to the gas station at the edge of town, until what had once been whispered concerns about missing pets took on a clearer, more unsettling shape. People spoke in lowered voices at first, as if naming it too loudly might make it worse. A network of illegal dog trafficking hidden behind paperwork and false assurances. Animals taken, processed, sold and erased from records as though they had never existed beyond their value. Deputy Ryan Brooks moved through those days with the steady exhaustion of a man who had reached the end of a long pursuit, his reports filed, his statements given, his testimony recorded with the same measured clarity that had defined his work from the beginning. And though he did not seek recognition, the town understood in its own way that something significant had been stopped before it could become permanent. Ryan himself had not changed outwardly, still carrying the same broad frame, the same worn cap, the same quiet authority. But there was a subtle easing in him, a release of tension that had settled into his posture without his noticing, because the weight of uncertainty had finally been replaced by resolution. When he stood outside the sheriff's office one morning, watching the snow begin to melt along the edges of the street, he allowed himself a brief pause, a moment of stillness that acknowledged not victory, but completion. And when Ethan Walker approached from across the road, Mara walking at his side with her steady, composed stride, Ryan inclined his head in greeting, the exchange between them simple, but grounded in shared understanding. No words were needed to explain what had passed between them in the storm, and none were offered, because the work itself had been enough. At the clinic, Claire Bennett stood behind the counter, reviewing a set of documents that marked the official closure of the case from her perspective. Not in legal terms, but in the quiet accounting of lives that had been brought back from the edge, and though her expression remained composed, there was a lightness to her movements that had not been present before. She had spent years working alone in a space defined by small recoveries and quiet losses, her resilience built from necessity rather than choice. But now something in that balance had shifted, because what had happened had extended beyond her clinic, beyond her ability to manage it alone, and in that expansion she had found something she had not expected. Not relief exactly, but a sense that the work could become something larger than survival. When she spoke of her plans, it was with the same calm certainty that had defined her in crisis. A foundation for a support network, a fund designed to assist veterans in caring for rescued animals, a structure that would allow what had begun as isolated acts of compassion to take on a more lasting form. Noah Bennett moved through these changes with a quiet confidence that had grown almost without his noticing, his posture straighter, his voice steadier. Not because he had become someone different, but because he had chosen, for the first time, to act despite fear rather than wait for it to pass. He still spent his afternoons at the clinic, still helped his mother with the routines he had known for years. But there was a new awareness in him, a recognition that his actions carried weight beyond the immediate moment. When he spoke now, people listened in a different way, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it. And though he remained the same thoughtful, observant boy, there was a quiet pride in Claire's gaze whenever she watched him, not in what he had done, but in who he had allowed himself to become. At the cabin, the changes were less visible to the outside world, but no less profound, unfolding in small, steady increments that reshaped the space without altering its structure. The snow that had once pressed heavily against the windows had begun to recede, leaving behind patches of exposed earth and the first faint signs of thaw, the air carrying a different scent now, less sharp, less final, as though the season itself had decided to loosen its hold. Inside, the fire still burned in the hearth, but it was no longer the sole source of warmth, because the presence of life had filled the spaces it once dominated. Benny moved through the cabin with a growing confidence, his steps no longer hesitant, but exploratory, his body still lean, but strengthening, his eyes brighter with each passing day, as the fear that had once defined him began to loosen its grip. Mara watched him with a quiet attentiveness that never wavered, her posture relaxed but ready, her gaze following his movements, not out of control, but out of care. And though she no longer needed to shield him constantly, she remained close enough that he never had to search for her. The change in her was perhaps the most striking of all, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete, the weight of her past no longer defining her in the same way, her instincts no longer buried beneath loss, but expressed freely in the way she moved, the way she rested, the way she allowed herself to exist without restraint. Where there had once been a guarded stillness, there was now a quiet ease, a presence that filled the cabin not with tension, but with something softer, something steadier. Ethan Walker stood at the threshold of this transformation with the same measured awareness that had defined him from the beginning, his movements still deliberate, his posture still shaped by years of discipline and restraint. But the distance he had once maintained between himself and the world had begun to narrow, not through force, but through repetition, through the accumulation of moments that had made isolation less necessary. When he signed the adoption papers for Benny, the act itself was simple, his name written in steady, controlled strokes across the document. But the meaning behind it carried a weight that extended far beyond the page, because it marked a decision he had once believed himself incapable of making, a choice to take responsibility not just for a life, but for what that life represented. The town had taken notice of Mara in its own quiet way, her story moving through conversations not as spectacle, but as recognition, a shared understanding of what her actions had meant, not only in saving Benny, but in setting in motion the chain of events that had led to the rescue of many others. She was not treated as something extraordinary in the way of public attention, but as something meaningful, a presence that people acknowledged with a nod, a glance, a quiet word, as if they understood that what she had done required no embellishment. In time, her name became part of the story Crestfall told itself, not as a legend, but as a reminder of what instinct, compassion, and persistence could achieve when allowed to act without hesitation. Spring did not arrive all at once, but unfolded gradually, the snow retreating into the shadows, the ground softening underfoot, the first thin shoots of green appearing at the edges of the clearing where Ethan's cabin stood, and with it came a light that felt different from winter's reflection, warmer, more direct, as though the world had shifted its focus from endurance to renewal. On one of those mornings, when the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth and the sky stretched clear and open above the trees, Benny stepped out onto the porch with a tentative curiosity that quickly turned into movement, his small body bounding forward in uneven bursts of energy, his legs still catching occasionally as he adjusted to the space, but his enthusiasm unbroken. Mara lay stretched along the wooden boards of the porch, her body relaxed, her head lifted just enough to follow his movement, her eyes calm, steady, filled with a quiet satisfaction that did not need expression because it had already been realized. She did not follow him immediately, did not hover, but remained where she was, trusting the space, trusting the moment, her presence still there, still constant, but no longer required in the same urgent way. Ethan stood in the doorway behind them, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. And for a long moment, he allowed himself to simply observe, not analyze, not anticipate, but exist within what had been built. He had once believed that survival was the final measure of a life, that enduring what could not be changed was enough. But standing there, watching the dog who had once lost everything now rest in quiet peace, watching the puppy who had once been left to freeze now run freely under a widening sky, he understood that survival had never been the end of the story, only the beginning of something that required a different kind of courage to accept. He did not speak the thought aloud because it did not need to be said to be true, and as the light of early spring settled across the clearing, touching the cabin, the trees, the ground that had once been frozen solid, he allowed himself to acknowledge what had taken shape in his life, not as a sudden change, but as a steady return. Mara shifted slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his for a brief moment before returning to Benny. And in that simple exchange, something passed between them that needed no words, a recognition of what had been lost, what had been found, and what had been built in between. The world beyond Crestfall continued as it always had, moving forward without pause, but within that small clearing, within the space defined by a man, a dog, and the life they had chosen not to abandon, something had settled into place with a quiet permanence. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the first true warmth of the season, Ethan Walker understood that what had begun in the cold beneath a snow-covered bench had not ended with rescue or resolution, but had grown into something far more enduring, a reminder that healing did not arrive with force or spectacle, but in the slow, steady presence of something that refused to let go. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive as thunder or light breaking through the sky, but as something small and fragile placed quietly in our path at the exact moment we are ready to see it. Because God often works not through what overwhelms us, but through what softens us. And in this story, a wounded man, a grieving mother dog, and a freezing puppy became part of the same quiet plan, reminding us that healing is not something we achieve alone, but something we are led into when we choose compassion over distance and love over fear. In our daily lives, we may not face storms like Ethan did, or moments as dramatic as a rescue in the snow. But every day we are given chances to notice someone who is hurting, to reach out when it would be easier to walk away, to become the reason someone else does not give up. And that is where real miracles begin, not in perfection, but in presence, not in power, but in care. And maybe the reason God places these moments in front of us is not just to save others, but to quietly bring us back to ourselves. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment to tell me where you are watching from or what part of the story stayed with you. And if you believe in the kind of quiet miracles that change lives, type "Amen" in the comments so we can stand together in faith. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of healing and redemption. And may God watch over you, protect your path, and bring peace to your heart